Good evening, and welcome back to Mo's channel. Today is March the 10th, 2019. In the last video, I spoke about economic systems using the U.S. economic model as an example. The reason I did that, as indicated, is because overall, hate it or love it, overall, the economic model that the U.S. has developed is the most robust and most capable, in my opinion. A lot of times, we may have biases, we may have hatreds, we may despise certain people, certain races, certain sexes. I may look at white people and say I hate white people, or look at Asians and say I hate Asians, and allow that hate, that distaste to blind me from learning from those individuals. You could hate white people all day, but if there's one thing that the white man has contributed to the world, is business structure. Chinese, Japanese, Africans, Indians have been conducting commerce for thousands upon thousands of years before white people were on the planet. White people were conducting business for hundreds of years. It was not until people like Henry Ford, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the robber barons, that this concept of structuring a business as a system and breaking down the different components of that business and analyzing them and modeling them and replicating them and optimizing them, that's something that was created by the white man, and that cannot be denied. The Japanese, total quality management, just-in-time inventory. The contribution that the Japanese made to the world of business, is in optimizing manufacturing. Out of TQM, JIT, you get Six Sigma, you get ISO 901 or 9001, whatever you want to call it. You get the capability maturity model, 1, 2, and 3 for business. So, just because you may hate someone doesn't mean you can't learn from them. Now, I say that as a lead-in to the problems ailing developing economies. The problems that face Africa, face Asia, face Latin America, and face the Caribbean. As I indicated, corruption is a factor. But when you reduce the footprint, the economic, the GDP, GNP footprint of the government, then corruption loses its relevance. As indicated, in the U.S., the federal government and state governments and municipal governments make up less than 20% of GDP, which means that the majority of the power driving the U.S. economy is private enterprise. So let's move on. We mentioned 6 pillars of an economy. The transportation system, which includes the infrastructure, your roads, your bridges, subways. The energy system, sourcing the energy, distributing the energy. The communication system, whether it be by phone, by email, by text. If you want, stand on top of a building, yell across town. If that works for you, that works for you. Getting word back and forth. The financial system. How does money move from where it is not needed to where it is needed? What controls, what assurances are built in there? So if I lend you $100, you have some level of assurance you're going to get, or I'm going to get my money back from you. The legal system. I'm doing business with you. I expect you to do A, B, C, and D. How can I enforce that upon you? I've paid you. I want to make sure you do the work. The legal system. Now, in Mexico, you have Mexicans. And some of these Mexicans sneak across the U.S. border. Undocumented immigrants. And they make $5, $7, $8, $10 an hour, putting roofs in houses, mowing lawns. Not much money. And they take their little money and bundle it up and send it back to Mexico. When their money gets to Mexico, they'll build a house, they'll start a business, feed their family. That is money that is not generated by the Mexican economy. That is money that is not put forth by the Mexican government, but it is money that contributes to the Mexican economy. So for the purpose of speaking to the development of African and Caribbean economies, I will negate the government. Because let us establish the fact, when Trump called these shithole countries, to an extent, Trump was right. You may say, oh, he's racist and this, but no. Face the fact. The majority of African countries are run by corrupt governments. The majority of Caribbean countries are run by corrupt governments. These governments will take in money that's intended for the purpose of developing their nation, their people. Take that money and hide it. They will take it out of the country. The World Bank might give Uganda a $50 billion loan. The president of Uganda, instead of taking that money to develop Uganda, will put that $50 billion in a Swiss bank account. The people of Africa are not shit whole people. Those are some of the most intelligent, vibrant people. The same can be said of the people of the Caribbean. Their governments are shithole people. Their governments make their countries shithole countries. Therefore, I am not going to focus on the government. I want to put forth a proposal to develop African economies devoid of the government. Let the politicians be corrupt. Let the politicians steal. Let the politicians enrich themselves. Fuck the politicians. So I'm going to focus on the African people, irregardless of their shithole politicians developing their economies. The one big problem that Africa has faced since its independence has been a focus on the production of raw materials. As opposed to selling you iron ore, to selling you steel, processed steel, or processed aluminum that you could then put into industrial production of buildings, of planes, of cars. I sell you the iron ore. Now, in business, you have the horizontal chain and the vertical chain. If you are a fashion retailer, your horizontal chain will focus on those elements that provide the inputs to your product. Your product is clothes. Clothes are made out of what? Cloth. So you're the retailer. Down here is someone that makes clothes out of cloth. That person needs to get that cloth from someone who transforms cotton or whatever rubber into cloth. So that is a vertical. As you move up the vertical, the price increases and specialization emerges. Cotton, whether bought in North Dakota, in Brazil, in Kenya, in Vietnam, is cotton. It's all the same. Now, I might make a certain type of cloth from that cotton. That cloth could be smoother. That cloth could be rougher. So I've attained some form of specialization. Further up the chain, I could make shirts, t-shirts, shorts, socks, all from the same cloth. So I obtain even further specialization. As you specialize more, your product becomes less and less of a commodity. The less and less of a commodity your product is, the higher the price you can demand. By African nations focusing on the production of commodities as opposed to the goods from which as opposed to the goods which those commodities produce, they bestowed upon themselves a lower price. Hence, as opposed to selling a steel beam used in construction for $500, I might sell the 5 tons of iron ore that will make that steel beam for $20. It costs me $15 to pull that iron ore out of the ground and process it. It costs me $100 to make that steel beam. I make 30% profit as opposed to 400% profit. Why is that? Let's go back to colonialism. During colonialism, Africans employed in Africa, Caribbeans employed in the Caribbean, performed rudimentary functions. They were cooks, they were waiters, they were kindergarten teachers or primary, secondary school teachers, that's grade and high school teachers. They were low-level nurses. They were not involved in the running of the economy. They had no idea, no knowledge, no training in how to run an economy. The ones who were the political activists, they were trained in psychology and history and philosophy. They were not trained in accounting, in finance, in economics. So when power was handed over to the Africans, you had people who had no knowledge of economics or business running nations. And the people within their nations had no knowledge of economics or business. So no one thought, instead of producing cocoa, instead of producing tea, instead of producing coffee, why don't we process that cocoa and sell chocolate and sell hot cocoa mix that you mix with water and drink, and sell tea and tea derivatives? They just sold the tea leaves. They just sold the cocoa beans. And so they stuck themselves at this bottom level. Having no understanding of business or finance or how money flows, the leaders fail to realize that by investing in the economy, I generate a much greater profit than if I stole this money and put it in a bank account that's going to give me 5% return. If I embezzle $1 billion and I invest that in Kenya, I'm the president of Kenya, I embezzle $1 billion and I invest that in Kenya and I put 1 million Kenyans to work. First of all, I will never have to steal an election again. I put 1 million Kenyans to work who can now feed their families. I'm guaranteed their vote. Second, that $1 billion will now pay me back at least $1 billion a year, as opposed to the 5% I might get hiding it in a Swiss bank account. Lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. That is why I want to ignore the ruling class in Africa. I want to ignore the politicians. I want to ignore the corrupt ones. And I want to focus on the Africans who are knowledgeable in economics and business. The Caribbeans, likewise. I want to focus on the Africans in the Caribbeans who may work out of Africa and the Caribbean earning a good income or even a decent income. Because the government is responsible for the infrastructure. Hence, there's not much one can do to develop that infrastructure. However, we have the communication system, the power system, the financial system, the transportation system to an extent. The legal system, once again, that's in the hands of the government. Now, if Africans outside of Africa, if Caribbeans outside the Caribbean would invest, so let's say we have 10,000 Botswanans living in the US, and between them, they make an average of $50,000 a year. They come together and they say, well, what would it take to develop an energy system in Botswana? You might need some generators. You might decide to go with solar for your source. But you price it out. And you don't have to start off with a whole nation. You could start off with a capital city or one of the minor cities that has potential for economic development. So now we're taking the government out. And these Botswanans research it, identify their target source, they acquire the relevant equipment and supplies for that target source. Then they define their distribution mechanism. So we might buy 10 generators, fuel them with diesel. We'll just go that direction. We'll fuel these generators with diesel. We will lay power lines, feed them to the homes in this city or in this village and the businesses. Then we start to supply power to this city. As we supply power to this city, of course, they're paying utilities. So we're able to maintain operations. We have sunk costs, and we intend to recover those over time, payback period. But operation costs, recurring costs, those are offset by what we bill our customers. Now, it might take you, Botswanans, 2 years to acquire the funding to set up this first power grid. After the 3rd year, you've generated sufficient profit that you could now go to another city and set up another power grid. 5 years later, you probably have power grids in 7 cities in Botswana. At that point, you've established your capabilities as a business. You can now approach investors. Tell them, look, we've been doing this for 6 years. We have power grids in 8 cities in our nation. We want to expand nationwide. Currently, we generate $50 million a year in revenue. Our operating expense is $10 million a year. So we have $40 million a year net. To expand nationwide, we'd need an investment of $100 million. We'll pay it back in 5 years. You've established yourselves. I'm an investor. I can look at your numbers. I see you are a worthwhile investment. You've gone within 5 years from powering one city to powering the entire nation without the government getting involved. By doing that, you have significantly expanded the economic potential of your nation. The same could be said for communication systems. Whether you want to build citywide wireless meshes, whether you want to lay fiber throughout the nation, whether you want to deploy cell towers throughout the nation. You start small, establish a revenue base. As that revenue base builds up, you reinvest in the company. You start serving one small market. You expand. You're in Africa. You're in the Caribbean. You have virtually no competition. You start serving one small market. You expand that market size. Then you serve a different market and a different market and a different market. The retained earnings, the potential to attract investors, enables you within a finite span of time to cover the entire nation. The financial system. Banking might be tricky. Banking might be tricky because for a banking system to function effectively, a government must provide sound regulation and oversight. So if you go to an African or Caribbean nation and you want to set up a bank, you have to fall in line with their regulations. Now, you could set up a bank in Ghana in alignment with Ghanaian regulations, in Jamaica in alignment with Jamaican regulations. But you use that bank to finance economic development. You don't have the capability to run credit checks. So you will not be able to make loans based on credit. But you make loans based on security. If there's a farmer in Ghana who's growing crops, but currently he can only farm 1 acre a season because he uses a manual hoe. If he had access to motorized equipment, he could farm 5 acres a season. Out of that 1 acre a season, he might make $10,000. With 5 acres, he could make $50,000. Off of that one acre with manual methodologies, he makes $10,000 off of a cost of $7,000. With 5 acres of motorization, he can now make $50,000 off of a cost of $10,000. Significantly higher profitability. As a banker in Ghana, you can now look at this farmer and see his potential and help him realize that potential by making a loan to that farmer to acquire that motorized equipment and that additional land. such that his profitability, his revenue may increase, and he becomes your customer. So, as a bank operating within the overall constraints of that nation, this is how you could spur economic development. This is where a group of Ghanaians living in the US, living in the UK, come together and say, let's form a bank in Ghana using our savings. And let's use that bank in Ghana to spur economic development in Ghana. A group of Trinidadians living in Canada could come together and say, let's form a venture capital fund. We each put in $1,000, $20,000, $50,000. We form this venture capital fund. Let's go to Trinidad. Let's find business people who want to start a business, who have a business they've already started. Let's invest 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 20,000 there, and take an ownership stake. Let them manage the business. We're in Canada. They're in Trinidad. Let them manage the business. We meet with them by phone, Skype, fly down there, fly them over once a week, once a month. Assess progress, establish strategy. If we have business experience in Canada, we advise them, we consult with them, we sit on the board of directors. As those businesses in Trinidad grow and expand, the investors in Canada realize capital gains. You're now putting Trinidadians to work, and you're now enhancing your wealth. You go on with your life. They're running the business. You're sharing in the profits. So that is how you can develop a financial system within these nations devoid of the government. Because you're now taking money from Africans, Caribbeans, who are outside of Africa and the Caribbean, structuring that money and feeding it into Africa or the Caribbean where that money is needed to spur economic development. In a sense, you can address the transportation constraints. Tanzanians living in the US might not be able to build roads in Tanzania. Then again, they might. A group of Tanzanians living in the US could buy road building equipment. A few of them might be civil engineers who actually build roads. And then they go to Tanzania, work a deal out with the government and say, we're going to build this road from this city to that city. It's going to be a toll road. Every car that steps on that road will have to pay. We will give you, the government, 30% of the profit. We will keep the other 70%. You start with one road. The toll that you charge is sufficient to maintain the road and generate an operating profit. From that profit, you build another road. and then another road, and another road. These are all toll roads. You're now building a transportation system devoid of the government. You could build bus systems to transport people within a city. You could establish trucking systems to transport goods. You could establish air cargo systems or airlines. You could purchase cargo ships and transport goods from Tanzania to Europe, to Asia, to the US. You are now promoting the economic development in your nation despite the corruption of the government. As a result of doing this, more Africans are gainfully employed. More Africans are independent of the government. The more Africans, the more Caribbeans that are independent of their government, the less corrupt the government can be. If a Jamaican does not need a handout from the government, if that Jamaican can wake up every morning at 7 and go to work knowing that he's going to get a salary and he's not working for the government and he did not have to bribe anyone to get that job, then when the prime minister comes around campaigning, that Jamaican can stand up and say, "What are you going to do for me?" Because he is not dependent on the government, so he cannot be bought. The transportation system, the energy system, the communication system, the financial system, and the risk management system can all be built independent of the government. By doing so, the people of Africa, the people of the Caribbean, wrest control of their destiny, their fate, and their independence from the political actors, and they enjoy a much better life. The one thing holding the undeveloped world back from the developed world is a lack of mature economic pillars. That is the one and only thing. The World Bank, the IMF, all these Western nations, they did not focus on building those economic piers because they did not want the underdeveloped world to rise up to compete with them. But were the underdeveloped world to develop those economic pillars, is done. Because then, instead of Africa exporting raw materials, Africa will develop the final product. Africa will develop the semiconductor chips. Africa will develop the steel. Africa will develop the cars. Africa will build the planes. Africa will build the technology. And then all of a sudden, the economic equation changes and Africans and Caribbeans are on top. That is why they lend you money, knowing you're going to steal it. So it's not going to go into developing the nation. Which ties me into the next aspect how to develop a black economy within the U.S. economy, and what the significance and power of such an economy would be. If you go to LA, you find a good number of the Mexicans are self-employed. A good number of the Mexicans are self-employed. These Mexicans go to Mexican doctors. They hire Mexican lawyers. They go to Mexican dentists. They eat at Mexican restaurants. They shop at Mexican grocery stores. If you go to the barrio where the Mexicans live, the essays, Holmes, Boto, Pendejo, I fucks with Mexicans. The corner stores are owned by Mexicans. The mechanics shops are owned by Mexicans. If you go to Chinatown, Koreatown, Japantown, if you go to Monterey Park in LA, if you go to Rosemead in LA, where you find a lot of Asians, if you go to Koreatown in LA, where you find a lot of Asians, the stores are owned by Asians. The restaurants are owned by Asians. The corner stores, the liquor stores are owned by Asians, and Asians go shop there. White people go to white doctors. White people hire white lawyers. White people go to white stores and shop. Mexicans start their businesses. Asians start their businesses. White people start their businesses. Black people shop at other people's establishments. I don't want to go buy something from a black store. I don't want a black surgeon operating on me. I don't want a black lawyer representing me, unless it's a racial case, in which case the black lawyer will draw more sympathy. Look at it. Look at it. Look at all the times a black celebrity has faced a case, and if the defense could be racism, look how many times he had a black lawyer. Yet, if the defense was not racism, look how many times he had a white lawyer. NFL athletes, NBA athletes, and MLB athletes, they're represented by white agents. That's why I respect LeBron. I respect LeBron. He had a black man represent him. I respect you, nigga. Prior to integration, prior to the Civil Rights Act, when black people lived in segregation, you had no choice but to go to a black doctor. You had no choice but to go to a black restaurant. You had no choice but to hire a black lawyer. And the black economy was thriving. You had Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association linking black people from all over the world doing trade with each other, raising millions of dollars, buying ships, buying farms. Go back to Reconstruction, when these beasts, as we were, 3/5 of human beings, beasts of the wild, when they cut those chains, said, go ahead, slave, you're now free. They expected us to fall flat. Go back, Study the history of the Restoration period, Reconstruction. Study and see how successful these black people were. That is why the KKK came about, to intimidate, terrorize, and harass these black ex-slaves. How the fuck can these animals be so successful? That's why Jim Crow came about, to mock these black people who dared succeed. The white man don't want to see you succeed. If he sees you succeed, he'll try and stop you. And if he can't stop you, he'll try and mock you. So it's not a matter that black people have never supported each other. It is something that we learned. When we had no choice, we supported each other. When we had a choice, we sought that which had been denied us for so long. I couldn't eat at a white restaurant before, and now I can. I want to sit next to Whitey. Eat next to Whitey. Whitey's right there. I'm eating right next to Whitey. I couldn't hire a white lawyer before, now I can. I want to be the whitest lawyer ever. That black lawyer had to take the LSAT to get into law school, just like that white lawyer. That black lawyer had to pass the bar exam, just like that white lawyer. That black lawyer is just as qualified